My name is Lila, and for as long as I can remember, the scent of oil, gasoline, and worn metal has been my favorite perfume. Dad's garage, Frank's Auto and Repair, wasn't just his business. It was our home, our playground, my classroom. While other girls played with dolls, I was handing Dad wrenches, learning the difference between a socket and a spanner before I could tie my own shoes. Dad, Frank, he's a man of few words but a heart as big as a V8 engine. He never pushed me into the life, but he never pushed me away either. If I showed interest, he'd explain. Simple as that. He'd let me watch, then let me help, then eventually, let me try. There were mistakes. Oh, plenty of them. Stripped, bolts, wrong fluids. Once I even managed to crosswire a battery and send sparks flying like angry fireflies. Dad would just sigh, rub his calloused hands over his tired face, and then patiently show me where I went wrong. Every mistake is a lesson, Lilybug, he'd say, his voice raspy from years of shouting over engine noise. Just try not to make the expensive ones too often. Our town, Harmony Creek, is small. The kind of place where everyone knows your business before you do. And the business of Frank's garage was often the talk of the town, especially amongst the old-timers who'd gather at the diner for coffee and gossip. Most of them were good folk, but some had opinions as fixed as rusted bolts. And one of their favorite opinions was that a garage was no place for a girl, especially not Frank's girl who should be doing something. Well, girlier. I tried to ignore it. Dad always said, "Let 'em talk, Lily. Your work will speak for itself." But sometimes their words pricked like burrs under a saddle. Especially when I got older and my interest in mechanics grew, from a childish curiosity into a real passion. I wasn't just good at it, I loved it. The challenge of a stubborn engine, the satisfaction of hearing it purr back to life after hours of coaxing, it was a feeling nothing else could match. The engine that changed everything, the one they called impossible, belonged to a car that was more legend than vehicle in Harmony Creek. It was a 1968 Shelby GT500, a real beast, owned by Mr. Henderson, the reclusive old man who lived in the big, slightly spooky house on Hemlock Hill. He'd bought it new, they said, raced it in his youth, then parked it in his barn some 30 years ago after it developed a problem no one could fix. It sat there, a dusty blue ghost, while Henderson apparently shipped parts of its engine to fancy city mechanics, all of whom sent them back with polite, expensive notes saying it was a lost cause. One crisp autumn morning, a flatbed truck rumbled down Main Street and pulled up to Frank's. On its back, shrouded in a tattered tarp, was the Shelby. Mr. Henderson, looking older and frailer than the legend suggested, climbed out of the truck's cab. "Frank," he said, his voice a low gravel. "Heard you're still the best damn mechanic in 3 counties. Dad wiped his hands on a rag, a small smile playing on his lips. "Try my best, Arthur. What have you got for me?" Mr. Henderson gestured to the flatbed. "The old girl. One last try. If you can't fix her, no one can. Then it's the scrapyard, I suppose." His voice cracked a little on that last part. When the tarp came off, even the resident sparrows seemed to hush. She was magnificent, even under layers of dust and neglect. Her Highland green paint was faded, chrome-pitted, but the lines, oh, those lines were pure poetry. And under the hood, nestled like a sleeping dragon, was the legendary 428 Cobra jet engine, or what was left of it. It was partially disassembled, parts in boxes, looking like a giant, complex, and very broken puzzle. They all said it seized. "Beyond repair," Mr. Henderson said, his gaze fixed on the engine bay. "Something about a warped block or a crankshaft that's decided to become one with the bearings. Every specialist I've sent bits to has given up." Dad walked around it, peering, touching, his brow furrowed. I stood beside him, my heart thumping. This wasn't just an engine. This was a piece of history. A challenge that made my fingers itch. "It's a big job, Arthur," Dad said slowly. A real big one. And I'm not as young as I used to be. He looked at me then. A long, thoughtful look. I knew what he was thinking. His back had been giving him more trouble lately, and some days the long hours left him utterly exhausted. Before anyone could say anything else, I blurted out, "I can do it, Dad. Let me try." The silence that followed was thick enough to spread on toast. Mr. Henderson looked at me like I'd just sprouted a second head. Even Dad seemed taken aback for a moment. Old Man Hemlock, one of the diner gossips who'd mysteriously appeared, cackled. "Frank, you gonna let your little girl play with that monster? She'll break a nail." My face burned. But Dad, bless him, just put a steadying hand on my shoulder. "My little girl knows more about engines than half the so-called mechanics in this town, Hemlock. If she says she wants to try, then she tries." He looked at Mr. Henderson. "What do you say, Arthur? She's got my eye, and a lighter touch than I do these days." Mr. Henderson hesitated, his gaze flicking between me, the engine, and my father. I could see the doubt warring with a sliver of desperation. Finally, he sighed. "All right, Frank. All right, young lady. But I'm not paying for a wild goose chase. If it can be fixed, fix it. If not, well, at least we'll know we gave it one last shot." And so, the impossible engine became my Everest. The first few days were about assessment. Dad helped me get it onto a stand, and I began the slow, painstaking process of inventorying every part, every nut, every bolt. I cleaned years of grime and mouse droppings, labeling everything, taking photos. The whispers started almost immediately. "Frank's lost his mind. That poor car. She'll be in way over her head." I tried to tune them out, focusing on the greasy, metallic reality in front of me. The engine was, indeed, a mess. It wasn't just seized. It felt like it had been welded solid by time and frustration. The previous mechanics hadn't been gentle. There were stripped threads, pry marks, and a general air of defeat clinging to every component. Dad would come in, watch me for a bit, offer a quiet suggestion here and there. "Easy does it, Lilybug. Patience is your best tool with these old beasts." He never once said, "Are you sure you can do this?" His quiet faith was a rock. The first major hurdle was getting the cylinder heads off. They were stuck fast. I soaked them in penetrating oil for days, tapped them gently, tried every trick Dad had ever taught me. Nothing. Frustration began to creep in, a cold knot in my stomach. I could feel the eyes of the town on me, even when I was alone in the garage late at night, the only sounds the hum of the fluorescent lights and the drip of oil into a pan. One evening, after another fruitless struggle, I slumped onto an old tire, tears welling up. Dad found me there. He didn't say anything, just sat beside me, his presence a comforting weight. "It's okay to be frustrated, Lily," he said finally. "This ain't a simple tune-up. This is a resurrection." "But what if I can't do it, Dad?" I whispered, the words tasting like failure. "What if they're all right?" He put his arm around me. "Then you tried your best on something everyone else gave up on. There's no shame in that." "But," he squeezed my shoulder, "I haven't seen you give up yet. Sleep on it. Sometimes the answer comes when you're not wrestling with it." He was right. The next morning, staring at the stubborn heads, a new idea sparked. Instead of trying to pull them straight up, what if I tried to rotate them, just a fraction, to break the seal? It was unorthodox, risky even. I could warp them further. But standard methods weren't working. With Dad watching, I carefully applied pressure, not pulling, but twisting, using a long breaker bar for leverage. There was a groan, a protesting screech of metal, and then a tiny movement, a hair's breadth. But it was movement. My heart leaped, slowly, painstakingly, working one bolt, then another, rocking, coaxing, I managed to break the ancient seal. When the first head finally lifted free, I felt like I'd conquered a mountain. Underneath, things looked grim. Piston rings were fused to cylinder walls. There was scoring. It was bad. But it wasn't, I thought with a surge of hope, impossible. The crankshaft was the next monster. It wouldn't budge. I tried heat, I tried cold, I tried everything short of dynamite. Days turned into a week, then 2. The gossip mill was churning overtime. Mr. Henderson would drive by slowly, his face etched with a mixture of hope and resignation. Started dreaming about that crankshaft. I read old Ford manuals until my eyes blurred. I scoured online forums for Shelby enthusiasts, looking for similar horror stories for any clue. Most threads ended with "parted it out" or "bought a new." Crate engine. One night, unable to sleep, I came back to the garage. The moon cast long shadows through the windows. I just sat there, staring at the engine block, feeling the weight of its history, its stubbornness. I started talking to it, soft and low. "Come on, you old beauty. Don't you want to roar again? Don't you miss the open road?" It sounds silly, I know, but in the quiet of the night, it felt right. I remembered something Dad had said once about an old tractor engine that was similarly seized. "Sometimes, Lily, you gotta surprise 'em. Do something they don't expect." What hadn't I tried? I'd tried brute force, gentle persuasion, heat, cold. What was left? Vibration, maybe? A specific frequency? That seemed a bit too much like science fiction for Frank's auto. Then, a really wild idea came to me, born of desperation and late-night coffee. What if the seizure wasn't just rust and corrosion? What if one of the previous mechanics had dropped something small, a washer, a tiny sliver of metal, into a critical spot, and it had wedged things up when they tried to turn it over? It was a long shot. A very long shot. The next morning, I got Dad's smallest inspection camera, the one with the flexible neck. Carefully, I started feeding it into every orifice I could find in the crankcase, through the oil passages, anywhere a stray piece of shrapnel might hide. It was like performing keyhole surgery on a sleeping giant. For hours, I saw nothing but old oil, sludge, and the dark, unyielding surfaces of the block. I was about to give up, chalking it up to another dead end, when the camera, deep in a narrow gallery near the main bearings, showed something. A tiny glint, not rust, not sludge. Something metallic, unnaturally shaped. My breath caught. It was almost impossible to reach. I tried long tweezers, magnetic pickups, bent wires. Each attempt was agonizingly slow, like playing that old operation game, but with far higher stakes. My hands were cramping. My back ached from leaning over the engine. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a tiny, mangled piece of what looked like a lock washer came out, clinging to the end of my magnetic probe. It was no bigger than my pinky fingernail. Could this tiny thing have been the culprit? The linchpin holding this whole mighty engine hostage? With trembling hands, I put a wrench on the crankshaft bolt. I took a deep breath, and I pulled. It moved. Just a fraction. But it moved. "Dad!" I yelled, my voice hoarse. "Dad, come quick!" He came running, wiping grease from his hands. "What is it, Lily Bug?" "Look!" I pulled on the wrench again. Another tiny movement, accompanied by a faint grating sound. Dad's eyes widened. He grabbed another wrench, and together, we applied slow, steady pressure. There was a groan, a shudder, and then, with a suddenness that nearly sent us both sprawling, the crankshaft broke free. It turned. Stiffly, reluctantly, but it turned. I burst into tears, a messy, sobbing laugh bubbling up. Dad just pulled me into a hug, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "You did it, Lily. You crazy, stubborn girl. You actually did it." That little piece of washer, probably dropped years ago, had been the main problem. It had wedged itself in such a way that any attempt to turn the crank just made it bite harder, scoring the bearings and making everyone believe the engine was catastrophically seized in a more conventional way. Once it was out, the other issues, the stuck rings, the surface rust, were still there, but they were manageable. They were problems I knew how to fix. The next few weeks were a blur of meticulous work. Honing the cylinders, replacing the rings, carefully cleaning and measuring every single component. Some parts were too far gone. The original camshaft was scored beyond saving. Finding a replacement 428 Cobra Jet camshaft wasn't easy or cheap. Dad helped me call around, his old contacts proving invaluable. We found one, NOS, new old stock, still in its original Ford box, tucked away in a dusty warehouse in Arizona. It felt like finding pirate treasure. The bearings were replaced, the oil pump rebuilt, every seal, every gasket was new. I cleaned the carburetor until it gleamed, each tiny jet and passage clear. Mr. Henderson started visiting more often, his initial skepticism replaced by a quiet, almost reverent observation. He'd bring coffee and donuts and just watch me work, sometimes sharing stories of the car in its glory days. He never rushed me, never questioned my methods. He just watched, his old eyes full of a hope he'd long thought extinguished. The day came to put the engine back in the car. That itself was an operation, Dad and I working the hoist, guiding the heavy iron heart back into its rightful place. Bolting up the transmission, connecting the drive shaft, wiring everything up. It was like a 1,000-piece puzzle, and every piece had to be perfect. The town was buzzing. Word had spread that Frank's girl was actually making progress on the Henderson Shelby. Some were still doubtful, predicting it would never run right, if at all. Others were starting to sound impressed. Old Man Hemlock was suspiciously quiet. Finally, the day of reckoning arrived. All connections made, fluids filled, battery charged. A small crowd had gathered outside the garage, Mr. Henderson, of course, looking pale and nervous, a few of Dad's regulars, even a couple of the diner gossips trying to look casual. Dad stood beside me. "You ready, Lilybug?" I took a shaky breath. My hands were sweating, but my heart was strangely calm. I'd done everything I could. Every single thing. "Ready as I'll ever be," I said. I slid into the driver's seat. The smell of old vinyl and something indefinably Shelby filled my nostrils. I turned the key to on. The fuel pump hummed. I pushed the clutch. It felt good and firm, and turned the key further. The starter whirred, engaged. The engine turned over. Once. Twice. It coughed. My heart hammered. It coughed again. A rough, hesitant bark. And then, with a sound that started as a rumble and swelled into a thunderous roar, the 428 Cobra Jet exploded into life. It wasn't a smooth, polite purr. It was a snarling, guttural, earth-shaking bellow that vibrated through the floor, up my seat, and into my very bones. The garage filled with the rich, intoxicating smell of high-octane fuel and glorious, barely contained power. It idled rough for a moment. Then, as I feathered the gas, it settled into a deep, rhythmic, loping idle that was pure American muscle. I looked at Dad. Tears were streaming down his face. He wasn't even trying to hide them. He just grinned. A wide, proud, beautiful grin. Mr. Henderson was leaning against the doorframe, his hand over his mouth, his shoulders shaking. He looked 10 years younger. The crowd outside was silent for a beat, then erupted into cheers and applause. Even Hemlock was clapping, a stunned look on his face. I let the engine run for a while, listening to its magnificent voice, feeling its power. Every pop and gurgle from the exhaust was music. I'd done it. I'd actually done it. The impossible engine was alive. Mr. Henderson slowly walked over, his eyes shining. He put a trembling hand on the fender. I don't believe it, he whispered. After all these years, I never thought I'd hear that sound again. He looked at me, and his eyes were full of an emotion I couldn't quite name: gratitude, awe, respect. "Young lady," he said, his voice thick, "you're a miracle worker." "Just stubborn, Mr. Henderson," I managed, my own voice choked up. "And I had a good teacher." I looked at Dad, and he winked. The test drive was a victory lap. With Mr. Henderson in the passenger seat, looking like a kid on Christmas morning, I eased the Shelby out of the garage and onto Main Street. The sound of that engine turned every head. People came out of shops, waved from porches. It wasn't just a car driving by. It was a legend reborn, a piece of Harmony Creek's soul brought back from the dead. And I, Lila, the mechanic's daughter, was the one who had done it. The car ran beautifully. The power was immense, terrifying, exhilarating. Mr. Henderson didn't say much, just gripped the dashboard, a wide, disbelieving smile plastered on his face. When we pulled back into the garage, he turned to me. "How much do I owe you, Lila?" he asked, his voice still shaky. Dad stepped forward. "Arthur, the parts weren't cheap, but for the labor..." He looked at me. I shook my head. "The satisfaction of hearing it run, Mr. Henderson, and seeing your face, that's payment enough for the labor. Just promise me you'll drive it. Don't let it become a ghost again." Mr. Henderson stared at me, then at Dad, then back at me. He fumbled for his wallet, pulled out a checkbook. He wrote for a moment, then tore off the check and handed it to Dad. It was for considerably more than just the parts. "For the parts," he said firmly. "And for the future of Frank's Auto and Repair. And for this young lady's college fund, if she wants it. Or for her own damn garage someday." He then turned to me and did something I never expected. He pulled me into a hug, a real heartfelt hug. "Thank you, Lila," he whispered. "You gave me back a piece of my youth." After Mr. Henderson drove off, the sound of the Shelby's V8 echoing down the street, Dad and I stood in the suddenly quiet garage. "Well, Lily-bug," he said, putting an arm around my shoulders. "Looks like you proved a few people wrong. Today." "We proved them wrong, Dad," I said, leaning against him. "We." He just squeezed me tighter. The story of the impossible engine spread like wildfire. The old-timers at the diner had a new favorite topic of conversation, and this time, it was tinged with respect, even awe. No one called me Frank's little girl anymore. They called me Lila, the mechanic, or sometimes the Shelby Whisperer. It wasn't about fame or proving anyone wrong, not really. It was about the engine. It was about the challenge. It was about the quiet, steady belief my dad had in me, even when I doubted myself. It was about the feeling of grease on my hands and the roar of an engine I'd brought back from the brink. That Shelby taught me a lot. It taught me about patience, about looking beyond the obvious, about listening to the whispers of the metal. It taught me that impossible is often just a word people use when they're not willing to try hard enough or think differently. Life in Harmony Creek went back to normal, mostly. I still worked at Dad's garage, still got grease under my nails, still loved the smell of oil and gasoline. But something had shifted. In the town, yes, but more importantly, inside me. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, who I was and what I was capable of, and every now and then, on a warm summer evening, I'd hear the distant, unmistakable thunder of a 428 Cobra jet engine, and I'd smile. Mr. Henderson was keeping his promise, and I knew, with a quiet pride that warmed me from the inside out, that I'd had a hand in making that beautiful noise possible once more. The mechanic's daughter had found her voice, and it roared.